Hello and welcome to Bitcoin with Jake. Today we have Mr. Dennis Porter. Welcome, Dennis.
Welcome, welcome to me.
Welcome
Thank
to
you.
me.
I'm so used to being the host of the show that I say welcome back. How funny is that?
No,
Thanks for
you're in
having
the
me
hot
on,
seat.
Jake.
You're in the hot seat today.
Yeah, I appreciate it, dude. It's fun to be on the other side of these things.
Yeah, I was going to say, so you're in the hot seat today, 100%. So I always start in the same way. Please, could you introduce yourself and give us a little update as to the projects you're working in today?
Yeah, my name is Dennis Porter. I am a Bitcoin advocate, political strategist, and a media. I don't know. I wouldn't call myself a guru or an expert, but I spend a lot of my time doing media, social media with Twitter. Also, going to be launching a new show here. Been doing podcasting with Bitcoin for some time, but we're going to be taking it live here May 4th. So I'm really excited about that project launching. I'm also working with the Bitcoin Advocacy Project, as well as a few other political organizations to push Bitcoin forward, like I said, as a political strategist perspective. So a lot of things cooking in the kitchen. That's like the way I like to do it, though.
Awesome. Well, I cannot wait to get into all of this essentially. So, um, yeah, I mean, let's zoom out a bit and take a step back. Where was home? Where did this
Yeah.
journey all begin from? And were you always interested in politics as a student, perhaps, or were you working in the media business before Bitcoin came along? Bitcoin's only 10 years old, give or take, and therefore there's generally some history prior to that. So I'd love to learn a lot more about where it all started.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would be remiss of not saying that I'm also recently the executive producer for Compass Mining as well. Really like loving
Congratulations
those
on that
guys. They're going to be
role.
helping
It's
me launch
fantastic.
they're going to be helping me launch the new show. So I'm very excited about that. Going back, man, I mean, I have a lot of interesting history. If you go far enough back, I'm just a normal guy, normal kid growing up in the Pacific Northwest, but homeschooled and in and out of public school, but never really found a fit. Kind of a awkward young guy when I was much younger. Eventually, when I was 16, my parents decided to move to Mexico, and we moved to Juarez, Mexico for 3 years. We lived there on the border. We spent a lot of our time building homes, orphanages, feeding kids that were on the street, educating them, spreading. We were also missionaries while we were there, so we were spreading, the gospel to them, and really trying to find a way to help people there on the street to have a better life. Funny thing is, though, is when you're there and you're in those environments, oftentimes people who have much less are so much happier on a regular basis than the average American. And, we have so much here. So I always find that as an interesting takeaway from my time there and my experience in Mexico. But spent 3 years there in Mexico, doing all sorts of things, everything, like I said, from building homes to orphanages to standing on stages with 5,000 people and doing solo shows for Christmas events. That was not my first time on stage. I kind of grew up on the stage doing lots of church plays, school plays. But after I left Mexico, I came back to Oregon, my home area. I was in Vancouver, Washington originally. Vancouver, Washington, and Portland, Oregon are like right next to each other on the border there. Came back here, and my parents left and moved to El Salvador. And they've been there for well over 12 years now, doing all sorts of mission work from, up and down the area there. It's a mostly focused on helping single mothers be able to go to school and go to church, go to college while the children are being watched. There's a ton of other programs that they do, so I would definitely encourage people to go check out the stuff for my parents' work. I'll share a link with you so you can share that with your audience. But kind of like spent some time on my own for the first bit in my early 20s, just totally alone for the first time ever, away from my family. Had my own moment where I kind of left the church and fell away from that lifestyle. Swung really far to the left politically. Started out, really really far on the right and conservative. And I still love a lot of the conservative values that are held today by people in this country, especially the economic ones. And had my own experience. Swung to the left, and in that time period, I became exposed to this idea that money is a big problem and that it's corrupting things all over the place. I began to realize how badly it was impacting the political system, something that I had been focused on for quite a long time in my life. Growing up, my dad would listen to talk radio. I'd listen to Rush Limbaugh, listen to Hannity before he had a TV show. And so I always kind of was very keenly aware of the things that were going on in our country. And so when I realized what the big problem was and that it was money, I became hyper-focused on it, and it kind of became like a single issue for me. Like I'm wearing my Bitcoin single issue voter shirt today. Like this was a single issue for me previously, was pushing back and making sure that money couldn't pour into these elections and corrupt the system. Inevitably, after things like Citizens United, I don't know if this is American politics, right? But Citizens United was what led to corporations and super PACs forming, which resulted in massive amounts of money being dumped into elections. And the problem with that is those that fought against it would lose because they wouldn't, you can't say, oh, I'm against super PACs, I'm against big money in politics, and then take big money and take super PAC money and take that corrupted, go within the corrupted system and say, oh, I'm going to fix it. Like that's not something that you can sell to people. So a lot of the folks who were very anti big money in politics ended up getting washed out because they didn't have millions of dollars supporting their political endeavors. So I lost my kind of focus on that as an issue, saw it as something that was not fixable, realized that the political system that we're in today is really too corrupt, monetarily especially, to be fixed from legislation. You cannot make corruption, you can't legislate it away. It'll always find its way back into the system. And so that was something that was a big part of why I fell in love with Bitcoin. Initially, it was some random person saying, "Oh, there's this anonymous internet money," and I thought, bullshit. There's no way you can't have anonymous internet money. That's what piqued my interest, right? Started studying it. Quickly realized it's not totally anonymous, but still, it was what piqued my curiosity. Fell down the rabbit hole, discovered Andreas Antonopoulos, and the thing that really set me free and really made me realize how important Bitcoin is its ability to remove the incentive to want to corrupt politics. So I'm going a little long here, but let me explain this last part because this is important.
I'm loving it.
Why Bitcoin is so important. You can't legislate away corruption because there is too much of an incentive to corrupt the political world that we live in today, right? Like the federal government, the president, the House, the Senate, way too much power. And there's no way you're going to be able to stop special interests, large money groups, high net worth individuals, multinationals from dumping money into elections because there's too much power to be had. So they'll always find a way around this corruption. It's like trying to stop water. Like it's going to find its way through. And so what we need to do is, instead of trying to remove or make it illegal for someone to corrupt politics, right? Because you can't stop it. They'll always find a way, a loophole, they'll always find a way through. We know that. You need to disincentivize the desire to corrupt politics. And the way we do that is with Bitcoin. That's one way, right? Because currently the most powerful tool that the federal government has is the unlimited money printer. And the decision to where that unlimited money gets spent. But right now, if you decide to say, hey, I'm going to fight against the corruption, I'm going to fight against everything, you really can't have a dent until you start talking about the unlimited money printer, because that's the ultimate power that it overshadows every other aspect of government. It is the ultimate power of our generation. And so whoever wields it wields incredible power. And so that's why large money, special interests, high net worth individuals, multinationals, that's why they want control of the federal government, because then they get to decide where the unlimited money gets spent. We all know how Bitcoin works. Bitcoin essentially pulls power away from that fiat system and gives it back to the people, or just distributes it broadly so that no one has the power to print money. So ultimately, this is what we're doing, is we're disincentivizing people from spending money in federal elections. I mean, look at, for instance, like my home state of Oregon. There is no cap on money spending here. Literally, like you can spend as much money as you want. It's legal. And when you look at that and you go, okay, well, that's interesting, because why aren't people spending billions of dollars in the state of Oregon? Because there's no power. Like, how much power can you really have? It's a pretty big state, but it's not a lot of population. It's a mild amount of industry. Nothing compared to like states like California, Texas, or New York. And so it's like, why aren't people spending billions of dollars? Because there's no incentive. There's nothing to be gained. There's nothing to be won by spending $1 billion. I mean, yeah, you gain some power, but the ROI isn't there. So it's not really about, when you look at the federal government, like caps and preventing it. It's like, we need to shrink the federal government. And the number one way we can shrink the government is by getting onto a Bitcoin standard.
I love it.
That's all for now.
We'll just finish there.
Yeah.
Oh, Dennis, there's too much to touch on. Wow, we could go for hours. Thank you. That was a wonderfully succinct and good explanation as to kind of what brought you to today. We're going to dive into different aspects to it for sure. Where I'd love to start is, what's it like growing up in a religious family and doing work that's clearly very people focused and mission driven, and dropping out of that world, like perhaps just a bit more flavor to what it was like growing up in a family like that, and then to suddenly find yourself in a position where you're not thinking the same way, and how do those two worlds look very different, or do they look very different?
Yeah. So very different. When when you grow up in that type of a family, which again, like going back, I love a lot of the stuff that came from my upbringing. There was a lot of values and a lot of wisdom that comes from the Bible that I still use today, right? But when I believed, I felt like I truly believed. This wasn't something that I was half in, half out. I just kind of woke up one day and realized that once my family was gone, I was by myself. Like, I wasn't really practicing anything anymore. And maybe it's because the support system was gone. I'm not sure. But when you're growing up in it, it's all consuming, and it's a big part of everything that you do in your life. You're going to church every Sunday. You're hanging out with religious people. Your worldview is definitely shifted. You see things through this lens of there's something beyond this life, and that you want others to have an opportunity to have that future as well, because it's a bright future that is taught in the Bible if you accept Jesus Christ's gift of his sacrifice. So growing up in it, for me, it was a great experience. I had great parents, loving parents, and never had anything happen to me that I would say was like, oh, this is why I left the church. A lot of people have these horror stories of, oh, I left the church because my pastor was XYZ, or someone abused me, or someone was violent, or it's not what it cracked up to be, and God screwed me over. Like, nothing really happened like that to me. Just kind of woke up one day and it's just kind of faded away after my family left. On the other side of that, personally for myself, I had a weight lifted off of me, because for a long time I felt like I had to be a certain way and act a certain way. And for the first time ever, I got to kind of determine what I thought was right and wrong, and what I thought was good for me and was good for the world. And in the beginning, it was a lot of bad decisions, right? Lots of mistakes.
That's part of life. It's so important to make mistakes. Yeah.
Fell into pretty heavy alcohol consumption, smoking cigarettes, drinking, partying pretty hard. So drug use, and ended up becoming like a club promoter. So all I did was just party all day long. Stayed up to like 4 or 5 a.m. pretty much every day. Like, I just went off the deep end, really, right? Like, yeah. To some extent, it was, the stories are true. Like, oftentimes people go off the deep end when they leave the church. But I went off the deep end and drove it like as far as I could. Ended up developing a very severe form of epilepsy.
Oh wow!
At the I was probably like 23, so it was about 10 years ago. Sometimes the dates are fuzzy, but got to the point where the epilepsy was so bad that I had to retire from my club promotion work, and ended up getting into a place where I was on medication all the time. And as someone who's been in front of people, who was like kind of raised to be a pastor, and always had this like idea that I would be a public speaker, and really saw myself as someone who needed to be out talking and sharing ideas and thoughts. it was really, really scary for me because it got to a point where the medication was so strong, I couldn't put words in front of each other. So like my sentences, like I would be thinking, it's like, you know, when you're trying to remember someone's name or you're trying to remember a certain word, like every once in a while, like you're having that problem and you're like, dang it, like what's that word? It was like that for like trying to put one word in front of each other. So just constant, hard, heavy brain fog. And so
Wow.
almost like I was a zombie. And I just woke up one day and I was like, this is it. Like my life's over. I'll never be able to accomplish what I want to accomplish in life. And it was like basically rock bottom for me. And so I woke up and I just one day was like, I got to do whatever I got to do to reverse this and to go back, to get back to somewhere. And so that's when I started focusing on my health a lot. So fitness, what I'm eating, stop drinking. I stopped drinking for, I think, 3 years completely. Stopped smoking marijuana completely. Obviously stopped drug usage completely. The biggest thing was also finding a physical therapist. If anybody out there, this is what I say. I say this in every show that I'm on because every once in a while someone reaches out to me and has in their life completely changed. But if you ever need a physical therapist for brain disorders, there's a guy in Oregon who does miracles for Tourette's, epilepsy, traumatic brain injury, whatever it is. It doesn't matter what the brain injury is. It doesn't matter what the malfunction is or the dysfunction. Reach out to me because this guy literally is like when he was doing it to me, I was calling it voodoo magic because I couldn't believe how well it was working and how little it's talked about in the current medical world. Like they just want to dope you up. This guy gets you off medication. So he got me off medication, and now I'm like 99.9% better. I used to be having grand mal seizures, like full blown, knock you out grand mal seizures very regularly, and then smaller seizures every day. And now I go days without even just like small ones. Like small ones would be like my hand twitching and stuff like that. Like sometimes that still occurs, but pretty dramatic turnaround. So if anybody has a family member, please reach out. Happy to share that contact with them. But yeah, then after that, I started setting a foundation for myself of health and wellness first, and then move forward from there. During around that time, like I said, it was kind of when I was finding Bitcoin. So I medically retired and was totally on my own. Started looking a lot into getting involved with politics. Started looking a lot into getting involved with Bitcoin. Found Bitcoin in 2017. Ended up mining right away. Started mining. Ended up getting like 20 ASICs in my garage. Had a really great time mining Bitcoin, but didn't do anything with Bitcoin publicly. Didn't talk about it. Was a total anon until January 2021, and that's the first time I jumped on Clubhouse to start speaking about Bitcoin. And I remember that first time I jumped on because I was sweating bullets. I used to actually have horrible stage fright, even back in the day when I was doing these big events. Horrible stage fright, and but Bitcoin is the one thing that's made me fight ruthlessly to overcome that stage fright.
Wow.
So now I'm talking about Bitcoin, speaking about Bitcoin regularly, traveling all over the country to share my views on Bitcoin, even though there's probably better people that can speak about it, but I'm happy to jump up and raise my hand whenever needed.
Well, I mean, Dennis, I have to jump in at that point. The more people that speak about this, the better. So,
Yeah.
And it's funny. I was going to draw back to this. You've segued nicely in a sense. I was going to ask you, from your religious beginnings and the family unit that you grew up with, like what characteristics have you savored or kept that you still hold value today? So as that kind of basic foundation growing up in a family as a teenager, and you were obviously heavily involved in spreading the story of the religion you were involved in, and there's something very religious about Bitcoin, and perhaps it was all meant to be, right? But are any of those characteristics that you think might have come through your life with you from that upbringing that now apply to Bitcoin? And this whole, doesn't matter if you're a non or if you're out in the open, this culture of the plebs, the Bitcoin plebs, I love it. It's just people like you and I getting up and just talking about the stuff we've learned about. Do you think there's any like constants from that time as a teenager that you brought through to today? And amazingly, you've obviously then shared all of these. Basically, you partied like an animal for a few years, which, don't get me wrong, everyone does, and perhaps you had a few years to make up for, and hence it got a bit more intense than it needed to. But the
Yeah.
it's like you've kind of come full circle naturally anyway. And I wonder if some of those characteristics from before played a part in that. So yeah, could you talk to that a little bit?
I would have to say one of my favorite characteristics that wasn't always held up, just because we are naturally, as humans, I think, a little messed up inside. But one of my favorite things that I think I pull from the Bible and still to this day is like not to judge people, not to judge their motives or the reasons why they're doing what they're doing. I think there's a lot of moral hazard in trying to interpret why people are doing what they're doing. In fact, I've come to this place now where I don't even think it matters with Bitcoin if why you're doing what you're doing. Bitcoin is one of the first unique movements in human history where even if you're selfishly motivated, like you're just here to get famous, you're just here to make money, Bitcoin will still like gain value from your desire to do that. Because the only way to really get famous in Bitcoin is to go do cool shit, right? Like look what Jack Mallers is doing. That dude's like a superstar now. But why? Because he's adding incredible amounts of value. Is that his motive? I don't think so. But if it was, would you be like, no, Jack Mallers shouldn't be doing that because his motives are wrong? I don't think so. Look at Saylor. Saylor literally is like one of the most famous people in the entire world right now. He gets 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 views on YouTube shows or podcasts where like some of the most powerful people in the world will get 5 or 10. But how did he get there? He added incredible amounts of value to the Bitcoin network. Again, would you be mad if you found out he did it because he knew it would make him famous? Maybe some people would be disappointed, but I wouldn't care. I want people to add value to Bitcoin and the Bitcoin network, regardless of what their motivation is, whether they want to get famous, whether they want to get rich, or whether they want to do good things for the world for moral reasons. Like, you know, ultimately, that's the great thing about Bitcoin, right? You're morally incentivized, economically incentivized, and even socially incentivized, which are the 3 key incentive structures in the entire planet. There's really no other incentive. Are you going to do something good for the world? Moral incentive, like a lot of people are very heavily morally incentivized in the Bitcoin community, especially draws those type of people in because it's one of the greatest goods that you could ever do for the world. Economically incentivized, you will get rich. There is no argument about that. You will gain wealth. You buy Bitcoin, you hold on to it, you will be much wealthier than you were last year. Or typically, you know, it's like a 4-year period. You know, you're up like what is it, 400%? So because it's up 100% per year. I don't know. We don't need to do the math. It changes all the time. And then socially, no one knew who I was like 16 months ago. Now I have 90,000 followers on Twitter. And every time I talk to someone in the political world, they're like, dude, everybody knows who you are. And there is a reason for that. It's because I get up every day and I figure out how can I push Bitcoin forward in the United States, because I know 2 things. One, I live here in America and I want Bitcoin to be protected here. People get mistaken a lot when they see me getting political. They think, oh, he thinks Bitcoin needs to be protected. No, I think the United States needs to be protected. I think the United States needs to fight to make sure that it doesn't fall into total collapse and disaster by making a critical error when it comes to the future of Bitcoin. Look what China did. It's like they just ruined their country for like potentially the advantage that they had. Like they're never going to get that advantage back. It's impossible. They had like 60% of the hash rate. Now they have almost 0. A lot of that came to the US, and that was a huge benefit to America. So going back, I want to make sure we secure that. I want to make sure it stays here because I'm an American and I want Bitcoin to do well here because I like Bitcoin. I think it's going to do incredible things for our country. It's going to do incredible things for the world. And it's going to do, I think it's going to go far beyond what any of us are imagining. I'm pretty hyper bullish on it. I'll stay hyper bullish on it. But for me, it's like, what's the incentive, right? Economic, moral, I'm doing good things. Social, like I try to ignore it, but I'm a human being. Like I just acknowledge that it's real. Saylor super famous. Jack Mallers super famous. Adam Back super famous. Anybody who adds a lot of value to Bitcoin gets famous. And I can sit here and pretend that it doesn't incentivize me, But anybody who tries to say that to themselves is, you're ignoring human nature. Human nature is you're incentivized morally, economically, and socially no matter what. You can't stop it. That's just the way we are built. And Bitcoin is the first movement in human history that aligns all three of those, regardless of whether you're doing it for selfish motives. Do I want to believe that I'm doing it for the right reason? Of course, everybody does. But ultimately, we are animals, and we are always going to succumb to those three incentive structures. I don't think there's any way around it.
The funny part to the conclusion of this, though, is to your point in some senses. One is helping to promote a meritocracy. So you may own more Bitcoin than anyone else in the whole world, but you can't change it. Quite unlike the guys with the money printer that you touched on at the start of the conversation, who were able to then influence future democratic processes with a shitload of money that they just invent out of fucking nowhere.
Right.
And so I love that point. I haven't heard anyone really make that before, which is, even if you think someone is a selfish wannabe and they're promoting Bitcoin, it's like no news is bad news. Like, it's only going to improve a rock or a foundation, or I don't know what you want to call it, like the bedrock of a future societal system, which is
Yes.
an incredible thought process to go through.
If you add value to Bitcoin, Bitcoin will add value to you. It doesn't care. It's a protocol. It has no emotion.
It doesn't care who you are.
It doesn't care what your motive is. It doesn't even sense your motivation. It doesn't understand motivation. It only understands, are you adding value to the network? And if you're adding value to the network, for some reason, which I haven't figured out, Bitcoin adds value to you. And people will take this and they'll say, Dennis is doing it for selfish reasons. That's why he's saying that. That's why he wants to bring this up, so that he can give himself, a gate to walk through in order to say, oh, it's fine for me to do it for selfish reasons. That's not true. I've tried to tell people this. I've tried to tell them over and over again. I usually get shouted down, and people tell me it's horrible. It's a horrible message to send. I think it's a great message to send. I think you should be telling people, hey, you can be selfish and still have an incredibly positive impact on everyone around you, because regardless of what we think about other people, certain human beings will always be selfish. Like, they're kind of programmed that way, maybe from childbirth, maybe because of, what they say, environmental or genetic reasons. Maybe they're a sociopath. Who knows? But I want everyone to be included in the Bitcoin network, because Bitcoin is for everyone. And I'd much rather those people work to the benefit of Bitcoin and have a positive impact morally and economically on every person that Bitcoin touches by adding value to the network, instead of doing the opposite of that. Because I don't like that they're doing it for selfish reasons. So I don't want them to work on Bitcoin. I just don't agree with that. I think everybody should be included to work on Bitcoin, and we should celebrate all good work on Bitcoin, regardless of the person's motivation.
But to your point, no, Bitcoin doesn't give a fuck. It literally doesn't give a fuck. You can turn up for whatever reason you want, and you can say for whatever reason you want, and people can say you shouldn't say that for whatever reason they want. But it doesn't care. My brother recently asked me, said, Jake, what do you think the kind of diversity metric is with Bitcoin? And I kind of like scoffed slightly, which is a bit mean, but he'd listened to my first episode, which is with Knut Svanholm. And it's a great story as to Knut's background and why he became an author, etc. But like, my bro's thinking, middle-class white male. Is everyone in Bitcoin a middle-class white male? And I'm like, well, first of all, Bitcoin doesn't care. If you're a middle-class white male, it doesn't care. And anyone involved in the Bitcoin network doesn't care either, because it can't. Like, it's just a set of rules.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter. And then, of course, you can start to explain some of the incredible stories you hear. My favorite YouTube that came out of the Bitcoin conference was Bitcoin is Freedom, and Alex Gladstein talking to Yunmi Park, and some other people from around the world that have seen insane impacts of a neutral monetary network in places that are essentially under like huge oppression. And you think, the question is the diversity, what's it like? It's just stupid in the first place when you start even investigating slightly what's actually going on. So yeah, that's a really interesting angle to take, Dennis. Thanks for sharing that. I'd like to go back a bit to the political corruption that you saw, and how potentially Bitcoin fixes this. But you mentioned that you left the church per se, and you ended up falling heavily down into the political sphere. can you tell us a little bit more about what that process was like and what you became interested in and why it was important to you? And you know, how does Bitcoin impact that? And I see this on Twitter in terms of, you know, I've followed you for a while now, and there's definitely a political angle that is a passion point for you. So let's talk a bit about that for a bit.
Yeah, so I ended up jumping into politics as like as work or a career roughly around 2015. Um, I I was so that was more of like an advocacy time. Got really engaged, really involved, really concerned. Inevitably, the outcome of that election was just wild, right? Like it was all over the place, and I kind of became disillusioned with the process after that, especially after just particularly I was, you know, in Oregon, I was very much aware of what was going on in the Bernie Sanders race. I also, as a single issue voter, liked the idea, just this idea, right? I didn't like everything else that he was pushing forward, but I liked the idea that he was pushing back against the special money, special interest, big money in politics thing. Like he saw the problem of all this money in politics and the corruption it would cause. No one else was talking about it. So I became aware of his race and then watched as the Democratic Party just like completely annihilated him, pretty much against the will of the voter. And so became just very disillusioned with the political process, but still loved it. Still loved like it's raw, it's real, right? It's
And
very
Dennis,
different.
if I could ask you just to flesh out a little bit, like when you say advocacy and really getting involved, like what do you mean? Like what is, like, on a day-to-day basis, you were part of an organization that was helping the Democratic Party, or your local representative, or you were out talking to people on the streets, or
Yeah.
just get a little more color if you
So it
can.
was pretty, yeah, no, it was pretty mild in the beginning, but being politically engaged, talking to people, being involved. I don't know what you, it's not a protest, like a rally, like going to rallies,
Yep. Like a
being
public
engaged with,
speaking event or something. Yep. Yep.
absolutely, and being engaged in that level of advocacy. So less of, I take a step back and say, less of a career, more of just like being a part of a movement.
Mhm.
And after that process became very disillusioned, but still very fascinated and have always been drawn to politics as a paid like career. And that's when I decided to go get trained by a political organization to do campaign management. Started studying, I might have books behind me that are like, started just studying different political ideologies and then also how to manage campaigns, and just became obsessed with the idea of like that I could impact the political system through my endeavors and through my efforts. Got trained, immediately turned around, started helping a guy in Florida who I met there. Also helped several candidates here in Oregon as well. And it was really, I really enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun. There was some fun moments like where I did some, you know, what do you call that? Roger Stone type stuff, like behind the, you know, it's a little bit of a, hot topic, that guy, but just kind of very like behind the closed doors, like helping to make stuff happen. Like I call them X Factor moments. I'm a big fan of creating your own X Factor. I have a whole theory on campaigns and how to win them and how to unseat incumbents, and that you need
Could
a
you
certain
share
amount of,
that?
yeah, yeah, sure. It's, I mean,
Yeah,
so you need,
I'd love to hear it.
campaigns are storied by X Factor moments, similar to life, right? But you know, you have a time window. Life, you can, you know, you make mistakes and make mistakes and you finally bounce back, right? Campaigns, like you have to get it to be in a good place at a specific time window. And so you need these X Factor moments, positive X Factor moments, or negative ones for your opponent to regularly occur. And especially when you're trying to unseat an incumbent, if you don't get them consistently enough, you won't win. I try to think of lots of different X Factor moments that make sense to a lot of people that have either a negative or positive impact, but there's none that's easier than Trump and COVID, right? We probably have to bleep that out, but the I don't know if you're putting this on YouTube or not. So, but if the pandemic hadn't hit, like it's arguable. Obviously, some people would like to debate it with me, but it's arguable that he would still be president, right? Because it was such a negative spin at the end of his first time in office, and so it really, things were going, I don't remember if everyone remembers, but things were going pretty well actually for him as far as like policy wise and economically, and things were chugging along. You could make some argument that some other X Factor moments may have occurred, but that was an X Factor moment that dramatically shifted the narrative of the race. I can talk to you all day about why, but I am of a personal belief as a political strategist. That's my opinion. If people want to debate that with me, happy to come back on and debate it. But campaigns are storied by these X Factor moments that occur, and I like to be someone who not only just observes them and takes advantage of them for the campaigns that I'm working on, but actually creates them. And I've done that multiple times in various races. I've done it in Oregon, and I've done it in other. I try not to talk about it like too much, just because some stuff is like private information. But you have to be willing to see something and go, "That's what we need to do," because it'll cause this to happen and this to happen. It's like second and third order. It's like playing chess a little bit. But one of them I can share a little bit about was there were three candidates running in a race, and they're in a primary. There's a dude that keeps winning all the time, this old guy. And the two people that I was friends with in the primary, if they stayed in the race together, they would never beat the old dude. He had too strong of a base. But the old dude, who would win his primary, kept going on to lose against his opponent. So everyone in the district was like, we need to figure out a way to get someone else to give them a shot to go after the incumbent, because this guy's not cutting it. He's already tried it like 4 times and lost. The two people I knew were not going to leave the race, right? They were like all in on the race. And so after some phone calls and some conversations, I was able to convince one of them to leave the race and run for a different office, a higher office. That's typically the only way it'll work. People will never run for a lower office. They'll never drop down.
Yeah.
So they ended up running for the higher office. Both of them won their primaries, and then that's kind of like the story, right? It's like, I created that moment and created that conversation, and because of that conversation, both of them were able to win their primaries. So that's kind of like one way of like creating an X Factor moment.
I've actually I've got friends get involved in politics, but no one's ever been involved in more from a bureaucratic perspective. They work as civil servants, or I've got parents' generation friends who have actually been members of parliament in the UK. But it's fascinating, okay, because obviously campaign management, this is a high, like it's a proper skill set. It's a very important part of a politician's kind of march towards, a position, so to speak. And it's incredibly relevant to Bitcoin. Like, one of the biggest things people will say, oh, I'm not buying that stuff because the government's going to ban it. Why? And what a rabbit hole that is to go down. We'll get there eventually. In 2017, you came across Bitcoin. You'd had this process where the election in the States had gone in such a way that you were just like, fuck this. I can't necessarily utilize the view that you'd previously had, where you could make things change from the inside with the set of skills. And then you came across this neutral money network that was radical, yet very refreshing, I'm sure, compared to the system you've been trying to work within. So perhaps you can just speak a little around what did you have a friend who told you about it, or like what was the first day you first really started looking at Bitcoin, and then we'll veer back around and understand what a difference it might make from a perspective of politics.
Yeah, so politics and Bitcoin were all kind of taking off at the same time as far as getting involved and also learning about Bitcoin and understanding the ramifications of the technology. Politics came a little bit first. When that crumbled, like that initial first endeavor, I found Bitcoin shortly after that. And then after I found Bitcoin, I started getting really into it. I was like obsessed, reading books, got Mastering Bitcoin behind me, was reading through that constantly. Really appreciated Bitcoin from the Andreas Antonopoulos approach, who's the author of that book, of its ability to bank the unbanked and have a positive impact on the disenfranchised and the less privileged around the world. Some time went on, and then I got back into politics and started to try to make a career out of it, despite the corrupt system. I was like, I still love it, right? And then after that had occurred, and I kind of, 2020 was like the end of my political career that had nothing to do with Bitcoin, right? Because the pandemic hit and I had a campaign that I was managing that was entirely dependent on knocking doors. And so because of that, it was like the campaign was over. Like we couldn't knock doors in the middle of a pandemic. Like nobody's going to answer, right? Or they're going to like
Get
call
away
the
from my
cop.
door
I mean,
now.
they're like going to lose their minds. That's a great way to lose a vote, is to be running and then like show up at someone's doorstep at the height of the pandemic. So after that is when I took a little very short break from pretty much anything, just because everybody was, right. Like we're all like stuck in our homes, and just really became obsessed with the idea that really needed to start talking about Bitcoin. I had been wanting to talk about it for a long time, but was a private, non-public Bitcoiner, public person, but not a public Bitcoiner. Like I didn't tell anybody that I owned Bitcoin. I never talked about it at all, actually. Even with maybe like one or two people like that I worked really closely with knew that I was a Bitcoiner, but just was very concerned about privacy and, getting $5 wrench attacked, whatever. We all had our like paranoia around Bitcoin, but just woke up one day and realized like I need to get over it. If Michael Saylor is going to YOLO his entire life into talking about Bitcoin, this guy's got so much credibility and he has his entire life that he's built, and now he's going to YOLO into Bitcoin, doesn't care what people think about him. Why do I care about myself when you got this guy over here? So he was a big inspiration for me to become a public Bitcoiner.
Same here.
That's why when I say like, I just don't care if he did it for selfish reasons, because it helped me become public and talk about Bitcoin and share Bitcoin, and all the work that I'm doing to defend Bitcoin in the USA arguably might not have occurred if it wasn't for him. And I'm not the only one. There are countless stories of people who just said, screw it, I'm going all in. I'm going to go all in on Bitcoin, whether financially, economically, with their pocketbooks, or with their time and their energy. More people are working on Bitcoin today because of Michael Saylor being so public and so confident about his position. So I don't care if people do it for selfish reasons, because it leads to more good things happening for Bitcoin.
It's so true. And I will also confess, like, hugely, how do you say, influential in my thinking. My personal story is, just to share that for a second, was more around, so I had an inheritance and my father died when I was very young, 20 years old, and I suddenly had this money. It's like, well, how the fuck do I look after this? And, I ended up investing in a number of different assets. Saving and investment are not synonymous. You take risk when you invest, but in an inflationary environment, you can't save. And for 10 years, I've been trying to solve this problem with, some successes, but also some failures. And then suddenly, here's a guy, stock listed CEO, founder of the business. He's got a legal department. He's got an accounting department. He's got shareholders to, prove that he's done the right thing to. And he just bought $400 million worth of this stuff. And it was in a specific interview with Raoul Pal. I remember it. Bitcoin infiltrates corporate America. And he did, much like we're having now, a conversation with Raoul Pal about his background at MIT and his upbringing, and then becoming an entrepreneur. And the one phrase that really got me was like, how do I know that the person who's in charge of my company 100 years from now has got the best chance of survival? I'm buying Bitcoin. And that, to me, as someone who's interested in preserving family wealth, is exactly the same lens that I'd been trying to use for 10 years and had never found a suitable solution, right? Everything's got management fees or risks or you name it, right? So I'm completely with you, Dennis. Like, what an awesome bloke. Thank you to him for all his work he does in making this subject so much more accessible. And I'm not an engineer. I never will be. It's a black spot in my personal, let's say, skill set. And therefore, with such an engineer centric technology like this, like, you need someone else to go and have a look at it and say, no, this does actually work. And then to be able to trust them on a YouTube video, that's another big step that probably wasn't previously possible. But, you can have a mentor on YouTube you've never met. Like, a lot of people would never even consider that to be, is that real? No, you can't. You've got to shake them by the hand and find out who they are. It's like traditionally how we would think about this stuff. But the access to education, etc., is just so different these days. And of course, the tricky bit is filtering what's right and wrong. And I fucked around with some ICOs. I bought a whole lot of other stuff that didn't make any sense. And, you suddenly start to think, well, hang on, what's the real problem we've got here? And you realize money has been a problem for humans forever and ever and ever. And suddenly, whoa, digital scarcity has been invented. This is pretty mega. and down the rabbit hole you go. And it's wonderful. And here I am talking to you, and it strikes me, the thing I find so rich about these conversations is everyone's lens is different. So I've just shared a little about why Bitcoin became important for me from the perspective I was in, but the political world you're operating in was your lens, right? And you're going, hang on, this might change something. So
Right.
to then, to pass the conversation back to yourself, like moving forwards, what is the world going to look like when democracy perhaps still exists and the political parties that operate within those democracies don't have access to a money printer? Like, how do you see that playing out from what you've experienced so far?
Yeah, this is a really important conversation, and I want to make sure that I get it right because I personally believe that Bitcoin will have a massive. Just writing myself a couple notes. Will have a
Okay, for it.
massive ramification on the political system. I think it will have a massive ramifications on the United States and the world. So for 10,000 years, we've been corrupting and debasing money. That's about how long it's been around as a technology. It's had really, really bad impacts on society. Um, Anytime we debase or corrupt money too much, especially when it's a world power that's doing so, it has pretty horrible things happen in and around when the money is debased or corrupted. I mean, I know you know the stories like when the Romans debased their silver denarii down to like a fraction of the silver that it had. The soldiers were just ultimately unwilling to fight for the currency uh, as payment, and was a large part in why Rome collapsed. There had a broad, very large border that they needed to protect, and soldiers that were unwilling to fight for it. So, that was a very bad event for Rome. Massive collapse, massive global collapse. Pretty sure that was a big part of what led to the Dark Ages as well. We've also seen it with the transatlantic slave trade. When the Europeans came south and realized that the African nations were using glass agri beads, which are just like basically just pieces of glass, as currency, they realized that they had a massive opportunity in front of them, and they started to create massive amounts of these glass agri beads, which are later dubbed slave beads, because the Europeans had advanced glass making ability at the time and the African nations did not. There was so much glass made, there were so many glass beads made, that the Africans actually started to sell each other into slavery because they thought they were getting untold sums of wealth. So some just very evil stuff that has occurred because of that, and that had led to the transatlantic slave trade occurring to the levels that it did. Right, like it may have still happened, but it was dramatically worse because of it. We also saw in Nazi Germany when the Weimar Republic hyperinflated due to currency debasement that it led to the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany, which resulted in World War II and the deaths and genocide of millions of Jewish families and humans and kids and mothers all across the planet. So just really, really, really evil stuff happens when you break money, right? Because you can debase it, right? And that's like causes problems. But when you break it, it's like, when money dies, like it just, society itself collapses. It's the base layer, communication layer across the planet for value. So ultimately, like, you can have the conversation around how Bitcoin fixes that. That's a long conversation. I think that Bitcoin fixes that because you can't debase it, you can't corrupt it. And so now we have this perfect, pristine collateral money that can be transported at the speed of light for nearly free transaction fees all across the planet, and humans can never control it ever again. So it kind of fixes that issue of like being able to break the money, because we as human beings just, how we have shown that we cannot resist the temptation to break the money, to debase and corrupt and destroy money. Like we just can't help ourselves. It's like over too long of a time arc, and it's too much power to be had in the moment. And it results in kind of what we're seeing today, right? Like we're seeing massive amounts of inflation. We're seeing the money supply doubled in a very short period of time in one of the most powerful countries on earth. We're seeing other countries, their currencies are collapsing. And then we have Bitcoin, where it can't be corrupt, it can't be debased. And hopefully we can kind of squeeze it in at the last second to really stop ourselves from collapsing. But some of the positive impacts politically, this is a little bit of a segue now. You know, Bitcoin fixes that problem, it fixes the money problem, it fixes the monetary debasement problem. There's a few routes we could go down on how this will fix the political system.
Well, where I was going was just to guide a little bit. As I understand today, you know, you mentioned before that there was no funding cap on political donations in the local area that you live in. The ability to print money, and then that money is basically sold as debt, and then the organizations that receive this are able to then deploy it wherever they want, and some of that's into lobbying organizations, which essentially are highly paid people that end up in political positions to massage legislation in destinations they want to go. So political parties are going to come under strain when their buddies in the money printing world can't just create money for them out of nowhere. And the political scientists have all of these grand ideas of, you know, let's build this infrastructure over here, and let's like subsidize people in old age, and let's do all these wonderful things that, you know, in theory make society much better, but we need to pay for it in such a way that, you know, it's possible. The ability to fund legislation is going to change. The ability to fund political campaigns is going to change. That's kind of where I was going with, like, you know, what happens when Bitcoin is far more central to our society.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But there's something very specific that occurs when you take that power away from the federal government. It will result in more focus being on the productive class instead of the political class. So right now you're incentivized to get extremely close to the government. You are really forced to get close to the political system in order to give yourself a regulatory moat, in order to give yourself funding as an organization so that you can outcompete your opponents. The market that we live in today, it behooves you to spend more money on politics than it does to R&D into your own company, because you can create a regulatory moat for yourself that's impossible to cross over. And so because Bitcoin has been created and will eventually become the standard, you know, obviously this is a very long time frame. It leads to less focus on the federal government and more focus on the productive class. But that will have other political ramifications. So because the current system we live in is the federal government having a lot of power, it's sucking a lot of the control that the states have had historically. So the United States is very different from any other political structure. We have 50 small countries inside of one federal system. Each of those countries or states is more or less like a sovereign nation in and of itself. And we all kind of agree to work together under the federal system. But what's happened over time is a lot of that power has been sucked towards the federal government, and a lot of the decision-making ability has been taken away from the states. And this has caused a lot of problems. It's caused a lot of political division in this country. So that's a huge issue in America today and across the world. The political division is at all-time highs, and it's created because there's a centralization of power where if you don't end up having control over that centralized body of government, you have a lot to lose. Like, you're going to get screwed over. And so ultimately what's happened is because there's all this centralization of power, the people in power are using that to target their political opponents. We see it with Justin Trudeau. He is, whether you agree with his decision or not, use that system to cut people out of the economic rails that exist today. And as time goes on, this is going to continue to spin out of control, because I might be a conservative and you might be a extreme left person, and we don't agree on anything, but that's fine. We can live in different states. But now the federal government has gotten so powerful that if I let you take over the federal government, you can like tell me what to do, even though I live in a totally different state. And this is true with the entire country or the entire world, right? It's happening on a global scale. But people need to be able to coalesce and form into tribes where they agree with each other and not have other people telling them what to do and controlling them. That's what creates division, right? Like you want to be with your own people and make your own decisions. And the federal government has gotten so powerful and out of control that it's breaking that system down. And so it behooves you to do whatever you can possible to take over that federal government. That's what part of the reason why there's so much incentive to control it, on top of just where the unlimited money printer gets spent as well.
And so, does that mean that with Bitcoin involved, we'll see a more decentralized society in a sense, or how do you think that will actually translate into daily life?
The United States like government was set up in a way where it was the reason why it was so successful is because it was so decentralized. Like we have the federal government where you have the president, the House, the Senate, the legislator, and then you have the states, individual, those are individual sovereign countries. And we've drawn towards centralization, and now we're going to go back to decentralization. And ultimately, it's just going to lead to putting more power into the hands of the individual people. Right now, it's like my vote doesn't matter. You know, being politically active doesn't do anything. But we're going to go back to a place where our elected officials are more beholden to the voters, and the voters have a better impact on the political system because they're not being washed out by special interest and large money donors, high net worth individuals, multinational companies who are spending untold sums of money to control that system. We need to, as is, you know, wrapping all the way back around, we need to disincentivize the desire to corrupt the government. And once we are able to do that, it will deliver more power back to the individual people.
Awesome. And it's, I mean, you've summed it up brilliantly there. For people that aren't interested in Bitcoin, you know, well, I think about this a lot, like how do we orange pill more people? And part of doing a podcast is, you know, that's what this is all about really, is who knows might listen to this. But we've all been brought up, I say we, so I'm, you know, from the UK living in Australia, you're based in the States. This concept of democracy is, you know, you have a say in how the function of the society is. And one just doesn't. One feels completely deluded. It's like, or what's the right way of saying it? There's no, there doesn't seem to be any feedback, right? They'll take your taxes and, you know, you vote at some point and then apparently, you know, that made a difference, but does it? Like, how's that impacted my day-to-day life? So perhaps exactly how you just phrased it is a brilliant way of helping get more people interested in Bitcoin. Is, you know, politically, this is a really interesting innovation to help you have more of a say in how your democracy actually functions, which I think is probably an underplayed part of this. Actually, I haven't spoken about this enough with people in the past. So I could talk for hours with you, Dennis. I've absolutely loved this conversation. What I'd like to do is just finish off in the next kind of 5-10 minutes or so and talk a bit more about some of the projects you're involved in. So the live show that you're starting very soon, and equally your role with Compass that you mentioned. So what an incredible, what is that, Jan 21. So basically just over 12 months, you've been hustling out in public, talking about Bitcoin, and clearly, you know, there's some great traction. I worked in the startup space for a long time, and, you know, to use a kind of lame phrase, but product market fit is really important. And it's very obvious when characters kind of reach that point, because it just kicks off, right? You suddenly have all these conversations, lots of people are interested. The social media stats, although probably highly addictive, also do portray in some sense, as you mentioned already, the value that's being created by certain profiles and people. So yeah, well done on what a journey it's probably been. Let us know a bit more about what the live show is going to be and what you're going to be doing with Compass.
Yeah, three things I want to just touch on there before I get, you know, that one of them is the show. But when you said, how do we get more people in? One way is to, you know, advertise this as like, well, if Bitcoin takes over, give it a Bitcoin standard, the political process will be less corrupt and will be more beholden to the individual voters. I 100% agree with that. Other ways to get people interested or to get elected officials interested in Bitcoin, really for me has been my focus, is to figure out what it is they're passionate about. Like, what is it that they wake up every day as an elected official and they say, this is the thing I'm going to fight for. For some, I've heard them say innovation. For others, I've heard them say freedom. And so you just have to figure out, what is that thing? Like, because every elected official has it. Like, I don't believe in this bullshit that like, oh, they're just here for power and they're corrupt and da 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 da. No. There's something inside of them.
Something's driving them somewhere. I agree.
There's something there that's where they're willing to die for. Like, they're willing to fight for. Every human being has it. And so figuring out what that is key, because it's very easy to tie it to Bitcoin. If it's innovation, well, Bitcoin's very innovative. I mean, it's one of the greatest innovations in human history. If it's about freedom, Bitcoin is also arguably one of the best technologies for freedom in human history. So it's just about figuring out what that is and tying it in.
And Dennis, I'll just riff with you there slightly.
Yeah.
Bitcoin solves so many different problems. So if you're in
Yes.
El Salvador and you're trying to send money to, or you're in the States trying to send money to your, cousin in El Salvador, Western Union's dog turd. I recently interviewed a wonderful guy, Lord Fusitua, who's from Tonga, and Tonga
Love that
has,
guy too.
yeah, he's a legend, right? And they have the same problem. 50% of their GDP is disappearing in fees. Something stupid like that, or 50% of their
Right.
GDP is remittance, of
It's
which
criminal.
30% disappears in fees. So one problem there is like moving money across borders, and then another might be how to finance political parties or political movements without, devaluing the average voter. That there's so many different problems that get solved. My case was storing wealth over time. It's the point here is that how you frame the conversation with people is
Is
Bitcoin single issue. Yeah.
That's why
Um,
that's why I'm a single issue voter, man. It's because like it fixes all these things. It's not really one issue. It's what's your issue? Bitcoin
we've
fixes
got
that.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like
I
what?
mean,
So
there's
yeah.
not
So
very
just
few issues that don't get fixed by it,
trying to
or
get
at
into
least
someone's head. It's like, what's the problem that this person has, and how can
yeah,
I prove that Bitcoin solves it for them? And
or
that's really
or
the kind of the philosophy, I think.
or like at least it has a positive impact. Like maybe it doesn't solve the problem, but it has a positive
Mm,
impact. Because some people will say like, well, how does it solve or how does it help with gay rights? And I'm like, well, it definitely gives you the ability to transfer wealth without having to ask the state for permission. Like you can give wealth from yourself to your partner without having to be concerned about whether the country, because this isn't just an American thing, but like the country you live in allows that to happen
mm,
legally
mm.
because all of our money and everything we own is digital or is controlled by the state. Like transferring a title from one person to the next, like you can't just do that. You have to
It
ask
requires
permission.
approval. Yeah, yeah.
So if you're a disenfranchised group or if you are a group that is oppressed politically, like Bitcoin is great for that because it helps you protect yourself, but your wealth, but it also helps you to transfer your wealth to your next of kin or to your partner without having to ask the state for that, the ability to do that. Like some people like get into those weird like angles or like try to tear apart the idea. And I'm
Mm,
like, again, it doesn't solve, there will always be problems in the world.
mm.
Like my thesis is that once we get Bitcoin pushed forward, that it will solve a lot of issues and will help fix a lot of problems. And then it will show us what's left over. Like, what are the real issues that we can tackle? Because we can't even figure out like how to advance human society because we're so torn apart by the fiat system. And then every cycle it collapses over and over
Yeah,
again. So we're having this very difficult like problem of like escaping as a civilization into like what some people like Kardashev 1, Kardashev 2, like some people talk
yeah.
about that kind of like we have a very difficult time escaping this these cycles because the money keeps collapsing.
Mm,
We might do it again in the near term, possibly. So once we solve the money problem and the money problem solves a lot of the issues we have on the planet, then we can start to really figure out like, okay, how do we really advance the human condition and the human experience? So that's why I'm a single issue voter. And I don't, people try to tear the idea apart and be like, well, what about Mayor Eric Adams? I'm like, I didn't listen, you got to vet the people. Mayor
mm.
Eric Adams clearly didn't understand Bitcoin. I never voted for him, first of all, because I don't live in New York. But second of all, because I just never thought he was a true, like, fully on Bitcoin guy. So very important to vet the people. But one other thing that I wanted to talk about just with politics briefly before we go.
No, no, go on. I mean, I've got a question I'm going to ask you that's going to take a while to answer. So let's just go for it. Come on.
Just the reason I jumped into politics is because I woke up one day and I realized it was a fantasy for me to leave the United States. That my family would not come with me. That if I like, and I also didn't ever want to be put in a situation where there's a gun being put to my head and saying, you got to sell your Bitcoin. Like we don't allow Bitcoin in the USA, right? Like it could be a metaphorical gun, like financial exclusion or whatever, right? Like it doesn't have to be a literal gun, but I never wanted to deal with that situation. I'm never going to be able to convince my family to move to more friendly Bitcoin shores. So I just woke up one day and was like, screw this. I don't care what Bitcoiners think about me because they're going to hate me for being super hyper political. I'm going to do everything in my power to advance Bitcoin politically in the United States and prove that it is a politically popular idea to be pro Bitcoin And no one, no one was pro Bitcoin. There were very few politicians that were pro Bitcoin before. I wouldn't say that I'm the main reason. Obviously, that I'm not going to take full credit. But before I started to move that direction, there wasn't this like, oh, like all these politicians like rooting for it. Now it's like boring. If a
Yeah.
politician says they're pro Bitcoin, they're like, so what?
Yeah. Yeah.
Guy's probably a scammer. Whereas like if you put Bitcoin in your bio as a congressman, like, you'd explode in popularity overnight. Now it doesn't do anything. They're like, oh, whatever. What,
Yeah.
are you going to release? You got to go pass a bill or something, right? Like get something done. But that's
Yeah.
been part of my thesis all along is that we need to continually push this forward as a popular political idea, get not only political candidates that are not in office to be on board so that they incentivize incumbents to be on board, so that eventually what happens is it's a feedback loop. Now the expectations are higher. They don't just want you to be pro Bitcoin. They want you to pass legislation. They want you to introduce a bill. And then eventually that's not going to be enough. They want you to pass a bill, right? So it's like our standards are raising, and that's a good thing. We want our standards to raise. We want it to raise to the point where we won't tolerate anything less than you passing a bill for us as a group, because that's what we want in order to vote for you and to give you money as a politician. And that's happening right now. The expectation for what people want out of a politician has dramatically shifted. When I helped Erica Rhodes launch her movement into the Bitcoin space, it was like they were just pumped to have a pro Bitcoin Democrat. Now it's like that opportunity is gone. Like you can't just be pro Bitcoin and a Democrat and get famous. Like it's you have to do something much more than that now in order to get famous. But that's important that bar continually rise and continue to get higher, so that we can get real results in this country.
It's fascinating. It's probably happening in all manner of different. I'm going to call it a marketplace. Just Bitcoin and politics is a marketplace. Bitcoin and health is a marketplace. Bitcoin and energy is a marketplace. Just different facets of how society functions. It'll be this kind of like step change. The wow factor has worn off. As you mentioned, putting Bitcoin in your bio, that is no longer a big deal. So what's going to become a big deal? How do you get the headlines? What is going to be a bit of organic public relations? Be a bit of a victory,
Orange pilling Trump.
Yeah, well, he's just the kind of character that might do something like that. And why not? Nothing's impossible, right? The question I wanted to get into actually, it's you have likely read the Sovereign Individual, and it's incredible in its insights from 20 years ago to now. The anarchists in the Bitcoin space. Interestingly, you've kind of slightly answered this already about fucking don't care what other Bitcoiners think about me. If I'm going to be political and also be into Bitcoin, fuck them. I'm going to do it. But do you see a bit of a collision here where the society that we built, we've been kind of conditioned to think that democracy is the right way to run a society and to have political class and have a political party and to utilize bureaucracy to manage ourselves. But there are people out there that will say, well, we don't need any of that any longer because we have a neutral monetary network that we can trust that is more of a kind of libertarian philosophy, shall we say, that enables people to act and behave out of their free will, but also,
Right.
rationally in a way that like we can actually we can deploy capital more effectively than ever before. How do you see those kind of characteristics like interplaying? Because this is a massive question. How society going to be structured in the future? I don't know, and frankly neither do you. That's not the point. It's about how do we feel, like where do we see this going? And yes, in the short term I can see, as you're already brilliantly explaining, there's going to be a profound change to the political landscape. It's already happened in 18 months. And just think what's happened in 18 months, it's going to speed up. You're going to start to see legislation come through that's going to give, Bitcoin mining companies all sorts of aggressive tax breaks, or it's going to give Bitcoin, no capital gains tax. That's just the most blatantly obvious one, right? Let people use it as a currency. How do you see that playing out then? Those kind of like different worldviews and how we're going to structure ourselves in the future.
Yeah, I like the idea that government is going to change. I think that it will. Will it stop being called government? Just like how we stopped having kings and queens, right? It's like government changes or will change, and it may change enough where we stop calling it government. Just like how the the ruling system changed enough where we stopped calling them kings and queens. That's possible. We could transition into a new era where there's a completely different way of self-organizing in our communities. Some people talk about city states. Totally think it's a great idea. Could happen. Potentially in our lifetime could be something that starts to occur to happen. I don't know. Personally, I look at like the next 50 to 100 years, and I don't see that happening at a large scale. Maybe at a small scale it could happen, and I could be wrong. Like no one knows. Like you said,
Yeah,
my personal opinion is that
and that's
we
what
will
I'm
see
interested. Like, how have you drawn the dots, and how do you expect that to play out?
we'll see a massive reduction in the power of government to the point where it's just a much smaller entity in and of itself over the next 50, 100 years. Like you can't continue to grow and fund massive amounts of bureaucracy when you don't have an unlimited money printer. It's impossible.
It's
Right?
impossible. Yeah.
So you'll see a shrink in government, an appropriate shrink. Things that don't matter, that we don't need anymore, will go away. That's a good thing. I think that voting will still occur, whether we do it on a blockchain, whether we have like a more secure system. I have no idea. I don't think that voting goes away anytime soon. I think it's just we separated money from politics. We didn't destroy politics. We didn't destroy government. We just took away the thing that they can't stop abusing. It doesn't mean that it's government itself is going to evaporate and cease to exist. So in the future, I think smaller government, more states' rights, more individual freedom, more like political class being more beholden to the people, less focused on the political class, more focused on the productive class. That's just kind of like where I see things going. And I don't see anybody able to make a argument that, all the states and all the federal government and every country on earth is going to like not exist anymore. Like borders are going to be gone, or like they're going to be redrawn. Like if that happens, like really bad things probably happen on that path. And some people believe that. They believe we're headed towards this like really dark time. Everything's going to fall apart. It's going to be cataclysmic and like terrible. I don't see that future. I think we narrowly escape World War III and the collapse of society with Bitcoin. Like I don't know if it's a time traveler or just extremely good timing, but I think Bitcoin barely saves us from that sort of a future. We may be bumpy along the way, but I don't see a world where, nukes are going off and the world is collapsing.
No, and it comes down to this whole concept of incentive. Like, what's the point nuking someone? In the past, military might was an integral part of wealth accrual. So the biggest army became the wealthiest because they could just kill everyone. And therefore, either you got killed and had your stuff taken, or you just gave it to them and then you survived and potentially had a way of creating more wealth some other way. Bitcoin changes that whole dynamic in terms of how you can potentially create wealth. And arguably, it's people sitting on the largest energy resources that have got the best kind of opportunity in the next 100 years
Right.
to accrue some of this this nascent technology. But
USA.
yeah, and the states will be
We've got a
so
lot.
strong at this. I mean, I'm based in
We have an
Australia.
incredible amount of energy here.
Well, and I have a Telegram group that I set up called Bitcoin Mining Australia, and there are people doing some incredible stuff all over Oz, and
It's
Oz
amazing.
is the size of a continent, right? It's
Yep.
absolutely fucking massive, and the amount of natural gas and other forms of energy that are in stranded locations that couldn't possibly be monetized in the current situation they're in, but are now potentially monetizable because of Bitcoin mining. This
I
is
love it.
extraordinary. And even going back to Lord Fosatua, he's got volcanoes in Tonga, and he's going to be able to potentially monetize that geothermal energy. Like the dynamic of military operations has completely changed forever. And there's a few people that understand this. There are many people that haven't yet realized.
Have you had Jason Lowry on yet?
I haven't had Jason on yet, no, but
Dude,
he
he's so
does
good.
have some incredible insights. I've listened to his
Yeah.
what is money shows, and I'll definitely reach out to him and ask him for a conversation. But it's that kind of cool thing. To your point, like, are we going to see a shitload of nukes go off when actually you can get rich a different way? Possibly not. Or equally, like the private property rights that exist today, why would you just like shred all of them when they could still exist going forwards and people are able to access the system on a more meritocratic way? That also to me doesn't really play out. So to your point, I'm less bearish in that sense of like complete global meltdown, and I see just a little bit of a rejigging as to how the political landscape functions from a perspective of how it's financed and therefore how it's motivated, almost exactly the way that you see it. But I hadn't researched and looked into it as much as obviously your experience brings to the table. So no, I mean, thank you so much for sharing all of this, Dennis. Yeah, I want to just jump into where we were trying to go, which was around the live show you're starting and your role with Compass.
Thank
If
you.
you have any other points you want to jump in on, then please do.
No, we covered one. Thank you for letting me talk because it's very helpful to be able to get the ideas out. Hopefully, I was able to get them out and communicate them. There was a couple there that I really felt like I was able to kind of finally, clearly communicate, and a couple that came up because of that I need to,
Yeah. Well,
kind of
that's what
keep
always
working
happens
on.
with organic conversation. No, well, you know what it was, Dennis. I
Yeah.
said to you before we started, we'll shoot for an hour. And I've looked over and I've realized my wife actually got the shopping that I needed to go and get before I started work. So I was like, oh, sweet. I've got an
There you
extra
go.
half an hour so we can carry on. And it's often the way that, if you're trying to keep everything to a fixed hour, so I don't necessarily prepare. I think organic conversation is by far the best way of understanding how someone feels, and I'm really keen to learn about people's characteristics and what drives them. And I didn't even get to dive into how it felt to hit rock bottom. And that's a whole conversation for another episode, probably.
Yeah, I
When
mean, it
you were
was.
feeling like shit, you're like, what the hell happened? So I didn't even get the chance to ask about that. But that's okay. We'll keep that for another time, because hopefully we'll get the chance to chat again in the future. So yeah, let's look to wrap things up a little bit. So you have a role with Compass Mining that I heard about recently. Well done. And you're also starting a live show. So let us know about that.
Yeah, I got brought on as the executive producer for Compass Mining. So they have a media arm. We'll be doing a lot of new content. We'll have this episode probably won't come out in time, but tomorrow we'll be launching our series of spaces that we'll be doing. And then in 2 weeks from, let's see, well, it's a little over 2 weeks, May 4th, on Hal Finney's birthday, I will be launching a new live show at 9:30 a.m. PDT. What is that? A noon? 9, 10, 11, 12. I always have to count on my fingers, right? Noon, 12:30 PDT, PM PDT, Eastern time. And the point of the show is to just go through all the things that have been going on in the Bitcoin space, go through the news, go through the current events, the price of Bitcoin, where it's at, where we expect things to go. Also talk about the latest in mining stocks and mining hardware, where the future of mining is going. Because, obviously with Compass, there's some good information that we have available to us due to that relationship.
The live show is part of your role with Compass, or that's a separate project of your own?
Well, they're going to be helping me with it. They're very involved in that process, and I'm very excited to have them as, team members. And we're kind of figuring out exactly like how it's described, or how it's not Compass's show, but I'm the host, and
yeah,
they're going to be helping me launch it. So I'm very excited.
So you're just going to do it as a solo host, going through the news yourself. You're going to have guests join, or how are you going to play it?
Yeah, so we'll have folks from the Compass team working with me on it as well, like helping to either come on as co-host occasionally, help me run through things. Also bringing on guests, trying to get a really great guest for the launch on May 4th. So TBD on who that will be. Got a couple people that I'm having conversations with to see what works for their schedule. Awesome. But yeah, May 4th, 9:30 a.m. PDT. We'll probably put the link down in the show notes for people if they're interested in listening to that show. But I've done a lot of interviews and a lot of live content with Twitter Spaces. Mm-hmm. And I've just found that there's this missing piece to the space, which is just condensing all of the information down. I love these long form conversations. In fact, I'm very happy to be brought on here today, but there's a lot of podcasts with long form conversation. And there's a lot of busy Bitcoiners that don't have time to sit down for every single one of these podcasts, or to be on Twitter all day long, or to suss out all of the important news or political events that are occurring, or understand whether, mining stocks are a better play than Bitcoin with the current market price, right? Like, we're just going to bring on experts, and also myself as somewhat of a expert myself in various fields. And we're going to go down the rabbit hole on each one of those and deliver that information in just a very condensed 1 hour, hopefully 1 hour or less. Sometimes it could go over, but try to get it really short. And then also, once we've gone live, for those that have missed it, we're going to break the segments up into pieces and launch them on the channel as well, so that people can really just get the information that they want and get out. And then they can come to your show for the long form conversation. They can come to the other podcasts when they want that
Yeah.
really organic convo, but just trying to deliver like fine-tuned information that every Bitcoiner wants. And oftentimes they're not getting enough of.
Fantastic. I look forward to watching out for that. And I mean, just to rhyme off that for a second, I see a huge opportunity in the media space for Bitcoin. And that's purely just driven by adoption. If you think today there are, I don't know, 100, 150 million people that have Bitcoin, and that's going to increase by, 10x in the near future. These are all, that's another 900 million people that need to learn about this stuff. And how are they going to find out about it?
Yep.
Well, they're going to find out about it online. Are they going to choose to do it with a podcast? Maybe. Are they going to watch it on YouTube? Maybe. Or Odyssey, or any other different platform that's doing things a little differently. So yeah, awesome. No, I look forward to watching that, and good luck with the project. And briefly, just to summarize, so Compass Mining. So can you tell us a little bit about them in case there's any listening that don't know about Compass?
Yeah, Compass Mining essentially just gives the average person the ability to mine Bitcoin without having to start up your own operation, host your own miners. So you can buy miners through them, and then they'll host them for you. Makes it super simple, super easy. Got a ton of friends who are using the service and love it. And yeah, it's a great way to earn Bitcoin, and it's a great way to mine Bitcoin without having to deal with all the logistics of mining Bitcoin itself.
Yeah, I love the concept. It's a really nice play in that space. Well, Dennis, lastly, where can people reach you if they want to get in touch?
Yeah, biggest place to reach me is Twitter. My handle is Dennis_Porter_, or you can just search Dennis Porter on Twitter. I'm lucky to be the only semi-popular Dennis Porter on the internet right now. So, and I've taken over all of SEO. I'm SEO'd out, and I didn't even try. Search me on Google, you'll find me as well. Top results. So that's where my show is. Also Dennis Porter right now, although we're going to be rebranding that for the new show launch here soon. But you can search me on there. You should be able to find it pretty easily. But yeah, DM me on Twitter anytime. My DMs are always open.
Awesome. Well, Dennis, thanks so much for taking the time to have the conversation today. Really appreciate it, and enjoyed hearing your story. Thank you.
Thanks, Jake. Appreciate you bringing me on.
Pleasure.